Ever since the announcement that Xbox would be shutting down Tango Gameworks, I haven't been able to get Hi-Fi Rush out of my head. Hi-Fi Rush was 2023's most surprising game. It came out of nowhere, and I fell in love with it immediately. Its combination of action and rhythm gameplay was a perfect match for me, as those are two genres I greatly enjoy. By all accounts, Hi-Fi Rush had done quite well, winning awards and standing out during one of the most stacked years in gaming history. And yet here we are, barely even a year later, and Hi-Fi Rush's dev team no longer exists. 2024 has been a rough year for the gaming industry, with mass layoffs, studio closures, and cancelled games. The demise of Tango Gameworks and Hi-Fi Rush is the most bleak representation of this, because if Hi-Fi Rush isn't good enough, then what is? I want you to keep this question in mind throughout this video as we analyze the tragic story of Hi-Fi Rush. On January 25th, 2023, Xbox held a showcase titled the Xbox and Bethesda Developer Direct. At this event, we learned about games in development including Redfall, Forza Motorsport, and Minecraft Legends. But alongside those games came a huge surprise announcement from Tango Gameworks. Tango was known for horror games, having previously released The Evil Within 1 and 2, as well as Ghostwire Tokyo. As Tango geared up for their next game announcement, it was pretty reasonable to expect another horror game was on the way. So when the flashy, colorful, and comedic reveal trailer for Hi-Fi Rush played out, it was quite the shock. But it was a good kind of shock. The kind of shock where you get something you never knew you needed before. But somehow, The Evil Within devs making an action rhythm game wasn't the most surprising announcement of the day. Because on top of that, it was announced that Hi-Fi Rush would be shadow dropped and would be releasing on the very same day. Rather than spend months marketing the game, Xbox and Tango chose to let the game speak for itself. And just a few hours after the developer direct, Hi-Fi Rush was released on Xbox and PC. I pretty vividly remember the day Hi-Fi Rush was released. I was walking back from class and I saw a tweet about the game, and what struck me was how unique it looked. It looked nothing like anything else Xbox had put out in recent years. I immediately started refreshing Steam waiting for the game to go live, and once it did, I bought it right away and jumped in. Right off the bat, I was enamored with this world and these characters. The characters are all so expressive and engaging, giving off the vibes of a Saturday morning cartoon. What helped these characters come to life was the wonderful cel-shaded art style, harkening back to the days of games like Beautiful Joe. Mix that with colors that pop off the screen, and what you get is a game that is a pure joy to look at. I do want to note that I've noticed YouTube compression absolutely destroys this game, so I would highly recommend checking it out for yourself to really see what I mean. As for the gameplay, it was a perfect combination of action and rhythm. Hi-Fi Rush has a unique combat system where everything moves to the beat of the song. If you time your attacks correctly to the beat, you will do more damage and be able to pull off better combos, but it's not a requirement. So let's compare it to something like Crypt of the Necrodancer, which features a similar move to the beat system. In that game, you physically cannot move your character or attack if you are off beat. Hi-Fi Rush opted for a slightly more casual approach, allowing the game to still be played and enjoyed even by those with awful rhythm. I think that is the single best decision the developers could have made, because it makes the game accessible to everyone while still allowing for the more experienced rhythm game players to be rewarded. And it leaves room for that uninterrupted, fast-paced action gameplay you're looking for from a game like this. As you fight and dance your way through the story, you will get to know the main character Chai and his friends as they work to take down the evil Vandalay technologies. The game is filled with fun levels, creative bosses, and even some fairly emotional story moments. Playing through Hi-Fi Rush was an absolute blast, and it was one of those games where you just never want it to end. I constantly found myself stopping to just look around at the scenery or listen to the music. The game stayed on my mind for weeks after finishing it, and honestly, half the reason I made this video was just so I could have an excuse to re-download it and play it again. Hi-Fi Rush was easily one of my favorite games of 2023, which is really saying something. As I mentioned previously, 2023 was one of the most stacked years in gaming history, so for a shadow dropped game to leave such a lasting impression on me is really quite impressive. As you can clearly tell, I love Hi-Fi Rush, and I'm not alone in that. The game was a critical darling, currently sitting at a 90 on Metacritic, and when it was time for awards season, the game was heavily nominated and was able to win a few, including Best Audio Design at the Game Awards. Player feedback was also phenomenal, with the game getting the overwhelmingly positive stamp of approval on Steam. As for the sales of the game, it's a bit harder to say due to Xbox's Game Pass. With a majority of players on Xbox playing games through Game Pass instead of buying them outright, we have to look at player numbers as opposed to copies sold. And so So with that in mind, Bethesda reported Hi-Fi Rush had passed 2 million total players in March 2023, just 2 months after launch. By August 2023, the game had reached 3 million players. Admittedly, these numbers are not all too impressive, considering there are somewhere around 30 million Game Pass subscribers. Despite this though, Xbox seemed very happy with the game. Aaron Greenberg, vice president of Xbox Games Marketing, took to Twitter and said Hi-Fi Rush was a breakout hit for us and our players in all key measurements and expectations. We couldn't be happier with what the team at Tango Gameworks delivered with this surprise release. While Hi-Fi Rush may not have set the world on fire with sales, the game had really resonated with those who did play it. And for a company like Xbox, who has really struggled to nail their first-party titles over the last decade or so, this was a huge win. It was the first time in a long time that an Xbox first-party team was able to deliver a really fresh, critically acclaimed new IP. In many ways, just having that notch on their belt is almost more important than the sales themselves. Over the next year or so, Xbox constantly boasted about Hi-Fi Rush and seemed very committed to it. For example, in February 2024, Xbox announced a new initiative where they would be bringing previously exclusive games to rival platforms. One of the first 4 games they chose as part of this initiative was Hi-Fi Rush, which came to PS5 on March 19th, 2024. Head of Xbox Phil Spencer had said the reason for this multi-platform move was to bring new life into their games and expand their IPs. And so I was happy to see Hi-Fi Rush's move to PS5, as I thought its inclusion in this initiative signified Xbox's commitment to the IP. But boy was I wrong. Because just 2 months later on May 7th, 2024, Xbox made the shocking announcement that it would be shutting down multiple first-party studios, including Tango Gameworks. When I first heard the news of Tango's shutdown, my reaction was a mix of heartbreak, anger, and most of all, confusion. How could Xbox be shutting down a studio barely a year and a half after making a game as widely praised as Hi-Fi Rush? It just didn't make any sense. Primarily because it directly went against everything Xbox had said about the game post-launch. Were they just lying all this time? Head of Xbox Game Studios Matt Booty said the reason for the studio shutdowns was to better prioritize high-profile games and further invest in Bethesda's blockbuster games. It's hard to take anything from that as it's just corporate speak. But what really fired me up was Matt Booty's comments he made the following day, saying in an Xbox town hall meeting, "We need smaller games that give us prestige and awards." Did he not just perfectly describe Hi-Fi Rush? To continue on with Xbox's history of mismessaging, Phil Spencer had said in September 2023 that Xbox would be committing heavily to the Japanese market, hoping to expand their current studios in Japan. And yes, for decades, Xbox has been desperately trying to grow their presence in Japan. So with that in mind, when Xbox acquired ZeniMax and all of their subsidiaries in 2021, Phil Spencer specifically mentioned Tango as a very exciting part of the move, since Xbox would finally have a Japanese studio. But despite Matt Booty's claim of wanting smaller, prestigious games, and Phil Spencer's claims of wanting Japanese studios, Tango Gameworks was still chosen to be shut down when cuts needed to be made. Those trying to make sense of the confusing move have fallen back on 2 main arguments. The first is the idea of Hi-Fi Rush being a small game. Some have argued that Hi-Fi Rush does not actually qualify as a small game, as it was in development for around 4 years. But I'm not so sure that I agree. Yes, the game was in development for 4 years, but it was being developed alongside Tango's other game, Ghostwire Tokyo, simultaneously, meaning that, presumably, only a portion of the team was working on Hi-Fi Rush up until the last year or so, which would have been the time in between Ghostwire Tokyo's release and Hi-Fi Rush's release. And either way, I don't think the size of a game should be defined by the years it took. Rather, it should be the amount of money or resources spent. And we don't even know exactly how much Hi-Fi Rush costs to make, so it's hard to say either way. Another thing that people point to as a reason for Tango's shutdown was Shinji Mikami's departure. Mikami worked for Capcom, helping to create the Resident Evil games, before eventually forming Tango Gameworks in 2010. However, in March 2023, Mikami left the company he had formed. Some have wondered if Xbox no longer believed in Tango without their leader, and that may have been part of the reason for the shutdown. But once again, I'm gonna have to push back here. Yes, Mikami was a huge part of Tango, there's no doubt about it. As a pioneer of the horror game genre, I can understand why there may be some trepidation about the future of the company without him. However, isn't Hi-Fi Rush living proof of Tango's future without Mikami? Tango showed they could step outside their comfort zone and create great games outside of the horror genre. So with Tango no longer being stuck in the horror game box, I don't see Mikami no longer being involved as the death blow that some have painted it to be. Especially when Mikami himself said amidst his departure that he didn't have nearly as much influence as people thought he did, and was instead much closer to a rank and file employee. I honestly don't think the excuses people have tried to make for the shutdown are are valid, and I'm ultimately left feeling quite disgusted by Xbox's decision to shut down Tango. I don't say that just because I'm a big fan of Hi-Fi Rush. I say that because the shutdown exemplifies everything wrong with the AAA gaming market nowadays. It's no longer good enough to make great games. It's no longer good enough to win awards. It's only about how much money you can make. And I can tell you right now, that is not a sustainable mindset. It's not a sustainable mindset for anyone in the gaming industry, not just Xbox. Having beloved IP is important. Having a game that wins you awards is important. And having a game that makes someone like me look at an Xbox first-party game as a must-play for the first time in a decade is important. Think about it this way. What kind of message does Tango Shutdown send to Xbox's other first-party teams? As an employee of one of those teams, I would be terrified. I would be terrified knowing that even if we made a beloved award-winning game, we could be shut down tomorrow. That kind of fear is not good for creativity. It's the kind of fear that forces developers to rely on established games or franchises instead of making new ones. Now, I should be fair here and note that this is not an issue that is exclusive to Xbox. We are seeing this across the entire industry. But I would argue that if any company was in a position to support a game like Hi-Fi Rush or a studio like Tango, it would be Xbox. Microsoft has nearly unlimited money, and let's not forget that Xbox also now owns Call of Duty, and Call of Duty makes billions of dollars every single year. Even the least popular, most hated Call of Duty game still made more money than 99% of all other games that will ever be released. It just would have been nice to see Microsoft take 1/100th of one of the billions that Call of Duty will make this year and use it to support a team like Tango. To me, not doing so shows a lack of commitment to games as an art form, and that's something I really cannot get behind. As you can probably tell by my tone throughout this video, I've never considered myself to be the biggest Xbox guy, but it was always just a general indifference to them. I never really took issue with Xbox, but honestly that's kind of changed since this decision to shut down Tango. It's hard for me to look at Xbox in a positive light after pulling the plug on a studio that had just delivered a game that was so special to me. And Xbox's confused messaging, where they paraded the game as a success just months before this decision, made it that much worse. It eats me up inside that Hi-Fi Rush's legacy will be known as Tango's last game, instead of the start to an incredible franchise. Hi-Fi Rush represents so much of what the gaming industry has been sorely missing. Hi-Fi Rush is innovative, creative, unique, and most of all, fun. To see a game like that have its studio shut down a year and a half later is so incredibly depressing. Hi-Fi Rush, and Tango Gameworks for that matter, truly deserved so much better, but unfortunately, no amount of ranting and complaining can change Xbox's decision. No amount of praise to the game can bring back Tango, or bring back the Hi-Fi Rush sequel that Tango had pitched to Xbox soon before their closure. So instead of harping on that more, let's end this video on a more positive note. While I certainly hate the way it ended, I am so grateful that Hi-Fi Rush was able to see the light of day. It was so cool to see Tango stretch far out of their comfort zone and create a game like this. As a huge fan of both action and rhythm games, it truly feels like a game that was made for me. Every time I play this game or watch footage, I catch myself smiling, and that's such a wonderful thing. Hi-Fi Rush is a game that I will always hold very dear to my heart, and I'm so happy I got to experience it. If you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, I highly recommend you do so. I promise you, you will not be disappointed.